Welcome back to Birth Podcast. I'm Ash. I want to introduce you to Eli Flournoy. He is a friend, a former colleague, and supervisor from my CNN days. And the last time we caught up, he said that he recognized that the system is rigged for him. You see, he's also a middle-aged white male. And so we step into conversation about the stories and lessons he has learned over the years around sexism, racism. And this is an important conversation to start. We need to talk about genderism. We need to talk about the culture of white men so that we can change it for our sons and for our daughters. So come with me, listen in, let me know what you think, share this with your friends, start your own conversations. What lessons do you hear in it? What do you agree with? What are you struggling with? Let's do this.
My career at CNN, I always said it was a bit of an experiment in applying servant leadership, which is an intentional philosophical leadership model that I tried to follow at CNN, and applying that into the super type A journalism, breaking news world of CNN, and it was an amazing ride. It was fascinating, always has been fascinating to me to see how people interact, how people respond to me as a manager or as a leader. And I discovered really early on at CNN. I started at CNN when I was 20 years old, and I learned that I felt more rewarded by the success of the team than my own personal success, and that's what I enjoyed more, and so I gravitated more towards that kind of those kinds of team dynamics, and I became very very interested in studying and trying to facilitate the best way to lead team dynamics in that very, very intense, often stressful, very fast-moving pace of CNN. So it was a fascinating career, but that was my leadership style was it was unusual for that. You didn't see that
Definitely.
style that often in that in the news business. But it was intentional, and I found it to be very effective. But hopefully others did as well.
I mean, you certainly went through those spaces with a lot of admiration and respect from people on the team because of that, because you are a participant in the team. I am curious, and what do you feel made you a little bit different than, say, other men who appear like you? So you are middle-aged white male who has grown up in America with a very a certain kind of expectation in terms of leadership and manhood. How did you feel that set you apart?
Well, I attribute who I am primarily to my parents and to my faith, to the mentors that I've had over the years through growing up in college and as an adult, and I think that my parents were both college professors. They were both senior administrators at Ohio University, so they were very experienced leaders and managers of people, as well as PhD academics. And so they also took a very intentional approach to their leadership style, and they were they were very advocacy focused. They were very activist focused in areas of race and in the environment in particular. So they taught me, and particularly the influence of my mom, to observe the way my parents interacted with each other, and to see the way that my dad, as a very powerful, strong, intelligent man, the way that he treated my mother, and the way that she interacted with my dad and with other senior people. I mean, people think of universities as being very, very progressive environments, but it's not that different than the corporate world in terms of it's very male dominated, especially at the higher levels. It's the same glass ceiling effects. And my mother and my family was very fortunate that there was a very strong group of men and women that they surrounded themselves with at Ohio University. And I learned a lot about that. I learned a lot about power and about how to what the appropriate expression of power was, because clearly I found out very early that I was starting out with a very significant advantage just because of the way I looked and my gender.
What's funny, Trill, on that just a little bit, because you talk about power and you talk about learning early on. Can you maybe share a story from your early years, maybe before necessarily you get into management at CNN, but growing up, obviously you have these incredible influences and your parents were lovely people, but I'd love to hear a couple of stories where maybe as a younger person, you kind of noticed differences. Maybe it was in a racial context, or maybe it was in a gender context, but how you as a younger person began to notice your advantages or just how you were noticing a difference between how you were being treated. But sometimes as we are in those formative teenage years, we're recognizing things we don't have language for, but we're still seeing the reality of what's happening. Can you share a story or two that may connect to that?
Yeah, I think I never, the first time I experienced a challenge to my power, to my position of power, really was at Indiana University. And so as an 18-year-old, I came in and I was immediately drawn to student government, which was very well formed. It was student government had a lot of influence at Indiana University, and I became involved very quickly with multiracial issues and issues of combating racism and the dynamics of a very, the state of Indiana is many of the small towns in Indiana are not very diverse. It's not a very diverse state. And I had I became the president of the second largest student government organization on campus. And one of my team, my executive team, was a African-American Black woman, and she we had a circumstance where she was filed a complaint against another employee of the organization that he was sexually harassing her, and so I approached this. I thought I knew the way to handle this. I gathered around the people, the adults, the administrators that I trusted, and they were, I knew they were good people, and that I knew they would know how to handle this. I'd never encountered anything like this before, and so gathered them together. We gathered in a in a room, and we had a sit down hearing and decided to confront this directly. And we had my colleague, the Black woman, and her the young man who she filed the complaint against, and then we had the group of administrators. And we heard from both sides. We had discussion about it, and in the end, it was agreed by the group that it was, it was a misunderstanding, that he didn't, he wasn't intending to. He was interested in dating her, but he was expressing himself in an appropriate way. He apologized. He said it would never happen again, and that was kind of the end of it. And afterwards, my colleague, who was also a very close friend of mine, who had filed the complaint, pulled me aside, and she just looked at me and said, "I'm so disappointed in you." And I was stunned. And she said, how was I going to say anything in that in that room? And I was like, what do you mean? I mean, we had all these people that we trust, that we've worked with for years now, in that room with us. And she said, they're all men. They're all white men. And I thought about it, and I was like, oh my God, how could I be so stupid? How could I be so blind? And I could just see my mother, who obviously was not there. I was like, oh my God, how could I not have seen that? Every single other person in that room was a white male of power. And even the young man who was accused was exercising inappropriately his attempt to hold power over her, to compel her to do what he to do what he wanted. And that was an incredible lesson to me that I have carried. I've used that example. I've thought about that all the time. And what that showed me was that it's not enough to have to have the right mindset yourself. It's not enough to seek other people that have the that have the right mindset. Diversity matters. It literally matters to have the people in the room with the right variety of perspectives.
But it's more than just the diversity, it's the agency of that diversity, because we can bring in women, Black folks, Indigenous folks, all we want. But if they are just sitting there and they are unable to participate, if they're unable to lead, if they're unable to be part of whatever the thing is, business, school, socioeconomic, socio-political conversation, then all we're doing is creating, really just a pandering conversation. And so I listened to your story, and I'm grateful that you had the relationship and she could come and confront you and say, hey, look, it was about her agency as a woman, and as a Black woman, she needed agency to be able to say, this is what happened to me, and this is what I need as a solution, rather than a room full of white men deciding for her what went wrong, what didn't go wrong, and what the consequences should or should not be.
Right.
And so I think that that's a really important lesson that you, as you say, that you learned in that space. How do we translate? How do we teach young men?
Yeah, I think that what I learned primarily from my mom, but also from my father and from other mentors that I had very young, was in seeing how my mother operated in a very male-dominated world, was that that power, the expression of power, it has to transition from gathering power and holding power to empowering. So what we have to teach our young people, and it's men and women, we have to teach them how to empower others, and teach them that is how you truly expand power. It's by sharing it, not just by modeling how to be successful yourself and how to be powerful, and hopefully they will do the same things that I did to become powerful. You have to actually and actively think about how to empower others.
So one of the more interesting things about empowerment is there's a unique aspect between control and surrender. So it's in control of self, so a self-control, and then surrendering to sort of the community. How can we teach that young man? What are some things you might say to that young man to help him understand a little bit better as he goes forward, so that he can be not just more mindful, but more of a participant?
It's really important for young men and women to have good mentors, whether that's their teachers, school coaches, in sports, even if those even if those activities are segregated by gender. It makes a huge difference how the behaviors are modeled, and and how the accountability to those behaviors, how those play out, and I think that one of the most effective things that I've seen for younger people in dynamics where it's there's naturally mixed gender, so just in normal classroom settings, is to have the mixture of genders on project-based assignments and stuff. And this really works both ways. You're seeing a lot of dynamic. I think this has been growing. This is not my field, but what I observe, and through my own kids growing up, is that there is a real dynamic of young men in academic settings feeling that loss of power, feeling like that is not their strength area, and they are seeing that it is strength area for their sisters and their female classmates in there. And so it's important both ways. It's important for them to be empowered in that dynamic together with women, and it's important for it's important for these group dynamics to identify where each other's strengths, how they can be stronger together, how they can be stronger working together, instead of I'm doing my thing. I'm trying to make myself powerful in isolation over here, and I'm in competition with all the other people, all the other boys and now the other girls. And when in fact we can all be much more powerful, we can be much stronger and much more effective if we work together as a team.
There's still a lot of complexity around sexism. It takes place in pretty much every industry. It doesn't matter, from journalism to Hollywood to all of this. Women still making a fraction of what men make in a lot of industries and places. Even in the journalism industry, you and I've had this conversation. I experienced a plethora of sexism in various industries. Again, it doesn't have to be just journalism, but in various industries, businesses, and organizations that are really struggling with how to create more representation of women, how to give women more voice, how to create those team dynamics, but also exemplify the strengths of the women within those workplaces. What are some things that you can recommend that would actually help create a solution?
It wasn't until my wife, who was an entrepreneur here in Atlanta, until she started developing businesses, and we started to come into contact with the finance industry, that it really, really hit me where that really, really deeply ingrained bias and sexism plays in. And we frankly, we reached the point when we were going out to get a loan for a new commercial building or for a new business, that I had to stop going to the bank for those, because literally the bankers, and whether it was a woman or a man, it didn't matter, but they would always address me first. Sometimes they wouldn't look at my wife, and my wife was the clearly established, known in advance that she was the business owner. She was the business. I
It's
was
her name. Sure.
yes, it was her name. It was her business. It was, I was there because we were co-signing, and as a family. And it was just ridiculous. It was crazy. But in recent years, after I left CNN, and I started to be involved in finance and investing, that's when I realized what is happening in this dynamic. Because investing, and whether that's a bank that is deciding whether to invest in a business person who they're giving a loan to, or you're making a direct investment, or your venture capital, whatever it is, investing is about risk. It's about assessing the risk of making this investment. And when I walk into a room looking the way that I look, at the age that I am, and that doesn't necessarily matter that much, but being a white, middle-aged, well-dressed, I don't necessarily have to speak before their assessment of risk is made the minute that they see me. And the difference between me and a woman or a person of color walking into that dynamic is that I am automatically, before they know anything else about me, I am automatically assigned the lowest level of risk in a business transaction.
Yeah. And
so that's the starting point for anybody that doesn't look like me in that dynamic. So what that means is, for me, is that I have to proactively be aware of that dynamic. And I have to, because I hold the power in that dynamic, I have to actively figure out how to empower others who don't hold that same power in that dynamic. And sometimes, like in the case of my wife, it means not going. It means removing myself from that from that dynamic. Sometimes it means, sticking up for, or forcing the forcing the issue. But in terms of teaching, like how do you change that dynamic?
Right.
It's incumbent on all of us to think about the team dynamics, to think of whether that's in hiring, in how salary levels are established. All of those things have to be, you have to understand and acknowledge that bias is there right from the very start, so that you can address it.
Do you think that middle-aged white men are so afraid to recuse some of their power?
Well, I think most men have not had the good fortune to experience things that I have experienced, which is that it actually benefits you more to empower others rather than to hold on to power. That's more rewarding. It's even more financially rewarding. It's not just a feel good thing. It's actually the most effective way to do business, because you can't sell products and services to the diverse world out there if you're only coming from one perspective. No matter how well educated or how well experienced you are as a person, is just different, coming from different perspectives.
And I mean, it's interesting you say that, but we also understand that, the 1% or the wealth of the world is mostly white men, at least on the Western side of the globe. And so, I'm curious to understand, has there ever been a time where you felt like you had to grapple with maybe your own loss of power in a situation that just felt like a loss of control? Maybe it was a work situation, or maybe it was a social situation where you had to kind of grapple with it post college, post the first story you told, that's been
Yeah,
complicated.
sure. Yeah, I think that you used the word surrender
Mm,
earlier, and I think that that's I think that's a really, really important thing. You have to learn how to surrender. You have to learn you have to take that leap. It's a scary leap, to give up control, to give up to give up power, because there's ego is an incredibly powerful thing. We worked, at CNN. That was one of the most fascinating things to me, was learning how to use, quote unquote, ego, and to get the most out of people by playing to ego. Ego is incredibly important. I just was having this conversation with a female colleague of mine, who's very senior level person at a university, and to convince her that her using her ego is incredibly important. It's important to have that motivating factor. This ego can cause bad behaviors. There are definitely negative sides to that, but it's important to be rewarded in that way, and it's important to manage that. So I find that if you can figure out what motivates people, and take the time to understand what other people are motivated by, then you can figure out a strategy for how to work with them, how to empower them, and get the most out of that relationship.
Final thoughts on, currently, what do you feel is an area that you are learning to surrender right now? What area of your spaces, whether it's work, personal, socio, political, whatever, but what's an area you feel like I think we're always, as humans, we're always constantly learning how to surrender, learning to use the positive parts of our ego, but when it comes to surrender, especially in the conversation right now that's happening, where do you feel is an area that you're actively practicing, learning, creating spaces for surrender right now?
Well, I think that the events of recent years, George Floyd, with with this really intense focus on race dynamics, that's something that I have been very conscious of and focused on, and worked on my whole life in different dynamics. But it is come back to in a much deeper way, in terms of evaluating where my biases are, and how, and importantly, what can I do about it? What is the most effective thing that I can do about it? And I think my dad grew up in a very racist environment in Texas, and he left that environment because he didn't like the dynamics, and he always said, which was a surprise to me when he revealed this to me, that he still carries those racist biases in his inside of him, in his mind. He just has learned how to not act on them. But I think a lot of people, and I think myself included, don't even know what those hidden biases, haven't yet articulated them, haven't yet identified them. And so we're literally going through a process in my church right now of kind of a racial reconciliation, or understanding those social justice issues. And because my mind very quickly goes to, okay, what is the solution? What is the action that I can take? And that in and of itself it's an act of surrendering. That's probably the hardest thing for me, is to realize that there are circumstances where action is not what is required.
Correct. Yeah.
That's not what's needed from me. And sometimes I just need to step back and I need to get out of the way and let somebody else lead.
I appreciate you saying that. And I really do appreciate you saying that there's work being done in your church, because I think that's really an important issue for the American church and American Christianity. So thank you for sharing that. I'm really grateful that we had this conversation. And I mean, I appreciate your stories and your thoughts and the empowerment that you bring to this part of the conversation. And we're all still learning. And I've always been grateful for your thoughts and your support and your kindness and all those things over the years. So I appreciate it. Thanks, Eli.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks, Ash.